Hello, I'm Eva, and welcome to my knitting podcast, which is called The Charm of It. I unpack my basket and tell you all what I've been up to lately. Thanks so much for returning if you've watched before or giving me a try. If this is your first time, I really appreciate it. This is my co-host Thistle, and my other co-host would be my cat Moth, who is currently looking at me from the couch. So we will see if she decides to come over or not. She usually does. Like much of the Northeast, we are currently experiencing the Arctic front, so it's quite chilly outside, so that's why Thistle has her little sweater on. I made it out of the sleeve of a thrifted sweater because Thistle is small. So all I did was I cut the sleeve off, and the curve automatically followed her body, so then I lightly felted it and cut a couple holes for her front legs, and the cuff of the sleeve became a little turtleneck for her. So really cheap and easy, and it was 100% cashmere, so it was very luxurious for her, and I think it was a men's extra large or something, in case you have a little dog that could use a sweater. I am wearing my Guernsey-esque jumper, which I knit last fall. My own design based on traditional Guernsey-style sweaters, and you can find more details on my project page. It's out of Elsa Wool Cormo, which is just super comfy to wear. So yeah. Staying warm. I also want to apologize in advance in case there's extra background noise because at the front my radiator isn't stopping, like it's constantly going, and it's an old radiator, so you can kind of hear the hiss of the steam. There's Moth. So I'll do the little reduced background noise 100%, and hopefully that'll be good enough for you guys, but I apologize for that. I'm drinking jasmine green tea today. And as I've explained before, when I was just watching podcasts, I didn't understand why people drank tea and other beverages while recording. But now that I record, I realize it's because your voice gets pretty hoarse when you're talking nonstop. So first up, I will talk about my finished objects. I have 2 for me and 1 for my sister. I appear to have entered a blue phase. So first up are my gloves that I told you about last time. I call them my Winter Morn gloves, and they're based on a free fingerless mitt pattern on Ravelry called Queen Lucy's Mitts. I knit them out of Quince & Company Tern, which is a silk wool blend, fingering weight, in the Booth Bay Blue colorway. And then they've got little cream beads. Sorry, the pets are trying to sort out how they're both going to fit in my lap. Okay. So here they are. They're showing up as a little brighter blue than they are in person. And here's the beading, which I really love. I think this pattern is super clever. I knit the body on size 1s because the pattern called for like size 3s, which I figured she must be a really tight knitter and I'm a very loose knitter. But I knit the cuff and the fingers and the thumb on size 0s to get the extra density to keep them a little warmer. And I found that they work really well as long as it's, I don't know, mid-30s to 40s. So that's what, 0 to 5 Fahrenheit. Once it drops much below freezing, then my fingers are a little cold. So I think the next pair of gloves I make, I'll either try stranded work so that it's a double thickness, or I will do a sport weight yarn. But these will be really nice, especially for dressy occasions when I'm not walking quite as much. And they were handy for the warmer days when I'm doing photography, so it's nice to have finger use. I added the thread. Now I can't remember what the name of it is, but the one that makes it so that you can use your smartphone without taking your gloves off. And I tried just knitting it into the tip, but that wasn't enough thread for my smartphone to recognize it. I have a case on my smartphone, so I don't know if that makes a difference. So then I just added some more loops when I was done. So I really enjoy the process of knitting gloves. I think it's very cool and kind of architectural, but you do end up with a lot of ends to weave in. I think I had to weave in 20 ends for these, but it's really simple to convert any fingerless mitt pattern to gloves. You just add fingers. And if you have never knit gloves before, I'm sure there are some free patterns on Ravelry that can show you how to do fingers, or Ann Budd's Handy Book of Patterns includes the glove pattern. So I'm really pleased with how these turned out. I didn't expect them to be, you know, deep winter warmth. I wanted them to be a kind of dressy, mild cold accessory, and that's how they turned out. I'm going to take a sip real quickly. I've missed you guys, switching back to the fortnightly schedule. I mean, I have to do it right now because of the other things I need to do, but I've really missed chatting with you guys every week, and clearly my throat is no longer used to it. So I also finished the color work mitts that I've been working on. This is based on a paid-for pattern called Starry Nights. It's basically a stranded color work adaptation of Van Gogh's famous painting. And my sister picked it out. I'll take my ring off before I try them. And it's for mittens, so I adapted them to be fingerless mitts and much longer. So that was the main point of adaptation. And as you can see, I have not yet woven in the ends. And I've only blocked one of them, so I thought this would be a really good example about the how important it is to block your finished objects. I apologize for all of the ends. I was so happy for these to be finished that I haven't looked at them since finishing the second thumb. Okay. Ooh. Oh, sorry, moth. I don't know if it's going to come across on the camera, but in person it's pretty clear that this one is blocked. Yeah. And this one isn't. And the fabric is this fabric is much smoother and more cohesive, and the stitches look a lot more even. Just a lot tidier. But so I'll show you. They go up pretty high. My sister, I think she wears one size higher than me clothing-wise, and so they'll be a little shorter on her, since the width will be more. But I'm really impressed with how this color work chart ended up turning out. As you can see, they're fraternal. On this side, this one has the church from the painting, and this one has, I don't even know what those are supposed to be, flames. Clearly Van Gogh is not my favorite artist. And then all I did to make it longer is I repeated some of the swirls up here. And then the palms I think are the same. They're close to the same. And the thumbs are very cleverly designed so that when they're, you don't actually hold your thumbs like that in real life, but it continues the pattern. Here, I'll take them off so you can see that. I really should have woven the ends in, especially since I'll be mailing these on Tuesday. So see. So the charts, obviously this is a very beautiful design. I will say that the pattern was not terribly user-friendly. The charts didn't have any numbers on them, which I like having at least the rows numbered. And then there weren't any directions if you were doing mittens for how to do the mitten decreases at the top or anything. So really, you're paying the $6 for the charts themselves, and it's up to you whether that is worth it to you or not. But I think my sister will really love the finished object. I knit them out of lace weight yarn instead of fingering weight because she lives in South Texas, and it doesn't get very cold there. So she's more going to wear them indoors if the air conditioning is too bad, and then on her commute to keep the sun off her hands. And it took surprisingly little yarn. I've got, the purple was the main color, and I've got over half a skein left of that. And then the white, obviously I have even more left over. So eventually I will ask her if she wants a matching hat or scarf. And by matching, I mean the same colors. I don't mean the same complicated chart. And I'm going to have to reset my camera, and then I'll tell you about my last finished object. My last finished object is my Blueberry Girl cowl, which I named after the Neil Gaiman storybook. I think it was a poem before it was a picture book, but I would read the picture book with my niece. And I named it this because this yarn is Barocco Ultra Alpaca, and the colorway is Blueberry Mix. So, as you can see, it is very fluffy and warm. Moth is jumping around her cat tree, causing trouble. And this is based on a free pattern from Ravelry called Brioche Infinity Scarf. It was my first time with Brioche, and I found it was really easy to pick up. people talk about learning brioche, and so I thought it was going to be kind of complicated, the way that color work is complicated when you're first trying to learn how to strand. But I think brioche is just a stitch to learn. I mean, I would put it, I guess, on par with learning to cable or do lace, but I found it simpler than both of those, at least this, which I think is brioche rib. But anyway, it was very fun to do, and so I've included videos. You knit it flat and then you seam it at the end, and I've included the videos that I found. Another Ravelry member had included them in her project page for how to do the provisional cast on and then later do the grafting so that it blends in the pattern, because that would be the tricky part of brioche. And it turned out really well. If I were doing it again, I would have done the grafting a little bit more loosely. I think I'm used to grafting sock toes, where, you know, you need it to be pretty tight. So that would be the one caveat I would add to the video. I'm trying to find the grafting for you guys. Oh, it's got to be here somewhere. Okay, well, clearly it blends in well. Yeah, so the brioche fabric is super light and fluffy, which I love. Once again, this color isn't coming through. I'm going to have to talk to my camera about how it does blues. It comes across as kind of a complicated navy blue, but it's a heather, so it also has aquas and purples and a little bit of pinks in it. It's really beautiful. Before I grafted it, I decided to add 2 twists. So all I did was, first I lined it up as if it was a circle, and then I did 1 twist, 2 twists. And I did that because, oh wait, here's the grafting. Okay. So see, I did it a little tight, so it comes in a little bit at one side, but as you can tell, if my camera's going to focus, the method works really well as far as replicating the stitch. This is the grafted line. So yeah, if I kept the tension more loose, it would be pretty much invisible. Okay, so as I was saying, I put in a couple twists, and I did that because I knew that it was going to be kind of on the shorter side. So I was going to wear it like style-wise, just looped the once. And I'm not a big fan of how just a plain circle looped around looks. I think it looks good on other people, just for myself. So if I'm going to wear it without any extra, you know, instead of 2 loops, then I wanted it to have a little bit of twist in it. And I made it quite wide, as you can see, so I really like that because it adds to the different ways that I can wear it. I can wear it more like a wrap, either with the twist centered or uncentered. Oh, there we go. And I can even put it up as a snood, I think, snood. So yeah, I'm very pleased with how this turned out. And then when I go outside and I need to actually be warm, it's nice and snug, and it functions as basically a balaclava, which has been super useful for the Arctic front. I finished this on Friday night, and I wove the ends in right away so that I'd be prepared for the cold front. Yeah. I guess that's all I have to say about that. This took a little bit less than 2 skeins. The exact details are on my project page. The skeins are 200 something yards each. It's just 100 grams of worsted weight. So I've got 3 more skeins of this, because originally I was going to knit my sister a blanket out of this colorway, and then I realized that a 50% alpaca, 50% wool lap blanket that is not machine washable is probably not the most useful thing for her. So instead I'm going to knit her a sweater out of a cotton silk yarn, and that means that I can use the blanket stash to do whatever I want with. So I'm thinking I'm going to make a vest or a waistcoat. I have one on I think it's in my queue. It's called the Button Box Vest. It's a free pattern and it's really cute. And I think that I would be able to wear it with quite a few of my winter clothes. I'm a big fan of navy and dark blues. They go well with a lot of my wardrobe. So yeah, I think this yarn is very, very suited to brioche. It makes a really fluffy, lofty, warm, soft fabric. And I definitely want to knit more brioche things now. I'm sorry, Thistle. Those are all of my finished objects. So before I get to works in progress, I thought I would give you guys a tip. No one asked a question this week. So my tip is about selvage stitches. If you know that you're going to be seaming a project, or if you're going to be picking up stitches on it later, then I find some patterns don't include a selvage stitch, which is just a knit stitch that goes all the way up. It's the edge stitch, so the very first one and then the very last one that you're dealing with if you're knitting flat. And so just knitting that all the way up, and don't slip it every other row, which is what you would do if it were going to stay shown. I find that just knitting it every row, so knitting on the right side rows and purling on the wrong side rows, makes it super easy to either seam pieces together, because you can use mattress stitch to line up the knits, the selvages, really easily. Or if you're picking up stitches, it's much simpler to see where to put your needle and get it in than if you're trying to pick up into purl bumps or pick up into something in pattern, if the rest of your project is patterned. So that would be my little tip this time. I hope that made sense. I'm not very good at explaining knitting technicalities, so I'll see if I can dig up a blog post about it in case you're interested. But yeah, it always surprises me when projects that are going to be seamed don't include selvage stitches, because in order to seam, you're going to end up with the edge stitch inside. So if you've knit that in the pattern, then it's going to disappear and it's not going to be viewable anymore. Does that make sense? So it could disrupt the pattern. So yeah, I've added selvage stitches to some patterns, and I think it makes life a lot easier. So that is my tip, and when I reset my camera, I will be back with my works in progress. Let's see, first up is the naughty work in progress. So after I finished my gloves, my winter morn gloves, I wanted to knit a hat because I had another skein of the same yarn in the same colorway, a different dye lot though, so they don't quite match, which is why I didn't want to make a project that took 2 skeins out of them. Once again, both of these blues are much more muted in real life, but you can see that this one is a little more popsicle-y. That's the best way I can describe the difference between them. I don't know why the colors aren't showing up. Maybe I can fix it in editing. If not, just trust me. Okay, so I decided to knit the Mary Margaret Lace Tam, which is a free pattern on Ravelry. I really enjoy Mary Margaret's style. She's a character on Once Upon a Time, and especially in the first season, I just love everything about her wardrobe. And she wears some great knitwear too, because the show is set in Maine, so clearly it gets cold. And I think it's actually filmed in Vancouver. And so I've been wanting to make this, and then it's got like a leaf lace pattern above the brim, and a few Ravelry members who have knit it have added some beads to the petioles of the leaves, and I think that that's a great idea since my gloves have beads. So in order to make it wearable in colder temperatures, I decided to do a double brim because it's fingering weight yarn, so that way my ears will stay extra warm. And since I want it to be dense to keep the warmth in, especially since there's some lace detailing on the body, and I'm a loose knitter, I decided to knit the brim on 000s and then the body on 0s. So first I cast on 140 stitches, and maybe 3 rows in, I went to put that around my head, and it seemed gigantic. So I ripped it back out and I did 120 stitches, and I did 30 rounds of 2x2 ribbing, and then I joined it so that it was doubled over, and I tried it on, and it is way too small for me. There's my head. There, yeah, that's not happening. So I was very sad because the only 000 needle that I have is a 40-inch cable, so I was having to magic loop the ribbing, and I do not like magic looping. I keep trying to like magic looping. I did it for my sister's mitts as well. And there's something about it that throws off my rhythm. It's not as bad in color work because usually there's a different chart for the top and the palm, so you're switching anyway. But for things that should be around and around, magic loop just ends up making me cranky. So I was very sad at the idea of having to do it again. So I ended up treating myself to a 16-inch 000 needle, which just arrived in the mail yesterday. And so I'll be frogging this back and re-knitting it on the 000s. But now that I have a 16-inch, so I'll just be able to knit around and around, it doesn't bother me anymore. But obviously, rather than frog it right away, I decided to put it in timeout and let it think about what it did. I think I'm going to cast back on with 140 stitches. Or no, I looked at it. The pattern for the body, like after it calls for 168, it's a 14-stitch repeat. And a lot of Ravelry members have said that they end up going down to 154. But I think what's happening is the pattern calls for size 3 needles, and I think the designer must be a very tight knitter. So since I'm knitting it on size 0s, which for me in turn gets me 7, maybe 7.5 stitches to the inch, that'll be fine. So for the ribbing, I'm just going to go down about 10% and do 152 stitches for the ribbing. And hopefully that will work. Sorry if that was too much math, like done too quickly, too many numbers thrown at you. The details are always on my project page, and so if you're extra curious. But yeah, I think I won't have a problem with it coming out too big just because I've gone down so many needle sizes. I don't know why my nose is itchy. It's always itchy. It must be winter. So my other new work in progress is a sock. I hadn't cast on for a sock in a while, and this was because I was knitting my sister's colorwork mittens, and so those were kind of my small circular project. And then I thought I was going to be casting on for my friend's Water for Elephant socks for her birthday right away, but we're going to wait until we meet up to talk about yarn choices, and then I'm going to have to wait for the yarn to come in, so I felt justified in casting on my own pair of socks. After I finished my cowl, I needed another simple project that I didn't have to think about. And so I cast on a pair of blueberry waffle socks. And this yarn was gifted to me by a very kind viewer. It's her favorite sock yarn. And it is the Mountain Meadow Barefoot. And it's a mohair merino nylon blend. And then it's hand dyed. And oh my gosh, I love this colorway so much. It's called Osprey. And yeah, that's coming out fairly true. And there's on the sole, you can see it's just the most beautiful colors. It reminds me a little bit of Marc Chagall, who is one of my favorite painters. I had never heard of him, and then I was studying abroad in St. Petersburg, and I went to one of the museums had a special exhibit on him. And I walked into the room, and I was just utterly entranced by his artwork. It's kind of, if he were a writer, I would say it's magical realist style. So it's a little bit folksy. People are not always obeying the laws of physics. There's a lot of flying people in his artwork. And it's just, I don't know, I connect with it. And so the colors that he uses are also very rich, but they're a lot more vibrant than these. These are like much dark, like the darker version of his colors. So that's why I've called the socks Chagall in Shadow. And the other reason why they remind me of Chagall is because his paintings are kind of folksy, as I said, so a little bit of deliberately rusticated, and the blueberry waffle pattern also strikes me as, you know, intentionally country. So I love this yarn, and I decided to try to get knee-high socks out of it. I'm not sure if it'll work yet, but that's why I decided to do toe up with the contrast toes and heel to maximize my yarn. And I'm using leftover Quince & Company Turn in the Barnacle colorway from a pair of socks that I knit a few months ago because it went well with one of the colors in this game. Is it going to show up? Well, okay. No, not going to focus. Anyway, I was color matching at like 8 at night. There we go. So that one right there struck me as similar. And so since I cast on toe up, I ended up having to redo the toe 3 times because I was doing too many stitches. Even though I started on size 0s, both Turn and the Barefoot are kind of plump yarns, and as we've established, I'm a loose knitter. So I ended up only doing 44 stitches for the foot, which is why I've knit so much since Friday. Because usually I do somewhere in the 60 stitch neighborhood, so this is a significant amount less. And the blueberry waffle pattern is so enjoyable. It's a free pattern on Ravelry, and every other round is just knit, so it goes really quickly. So for the heel, I did the same heel that I used in this little piggy socks, and I'll include the link on my project page again. And I did the Eye of Partridge heel flap this time instead of just a regular slip stitch, because I especially like how the Eye of Partridge looks in variegated yarn. I'm gonna zoom. No. Here, I'll take it out. And so far, as you can see, I'm pretty high up, and I think I've used 25 grams out of the 100 gram skein. So it is definitely possible that I'm going to get fairly close to the knee. There's the Eye of Partridge. So far, all the calf shaping I've done has been to progress from size 0s to size 1s, and now I'm on size 1.5s, and that's what I'm going to stick with. So any future calf shaping will be in increases instead of needle sizes. And yeah, I'm pretty hopeful about how tall they're going to be, and I'm just utterly in love with this yarn and this pattern, and I'm really happy about how it's turning out. When I come back, I'm going to talk about the sweater I've been working on. The last episode, which was 2 weeks ago, I had just finished swatching, in a very epic swatch since I'm designing this sweater myself. And so things have progressed quite a bit since then, and I have 2 cardigan front pieces to show you. I'm really pleased with how these turned out. So I ended up doing a honeycomb peplum, and these haven't been blocked yet. And then for the waistband, I did seed stitch, and I added 3 welts or pin tucks, just because, you know, this is such a decorative, sturdy fabric that I thought the waistband needed something extra to kind of hold its own. And then for the body, I have a braid cable. I think this is a wheat ear cable, and then the center cable is from Alice Starmore's Aran Knitting Book. And the waist shaping I did in seed stitch, because the cables make for a much thicker fabric. And as you can see, then the armhole and all the way up. And meanwhile, I'm doing a V-neck because I'm going to pick up and do a shawl collar. And here's my little selvage stitch, since I mentioned that in tips. So that'll make it much easier to pick up. So the other times that I've knit a cardigan in pieces, I still knit the 2 front pieces at once, just using 2 balls of yarn on the same long cable. But this time I wanted to make sure that I took good notes, so I did it one at a time, which was slightly terrifying when I got to the second one and had to, you know, reconstruct it based on my fairly succinct notes. But it ended up working out after a couple false starts, and I'm glad that I'll be able to put my notes up on Ravelry to help you guys. And then I've just started the peplum for the back. Just got the first set of honeycomb cables, which the camera is not going to focus on. And this will take, you know, after doing the front pieces one at a time, this feels like the longest row ever, but it's still not that long. And I thought that I would go into a little bit of detail because several of you have expressed curiosity about how you design your own knitwear, basically. And this sweater is definitely the most complicated design that I've done. This was my first completely self-designed. Well, even my first cardigan, I basically built myself. Anyway, and clearly this one was much simpler because a lot of it is just knit. But in case it's helpful to you guys, I have included some details. So first, as I mentioned last time, did a lot of swatching, and that was to get to know the yarn, get to know what the different cables were going to look like in the yarn, and get an idea of gauge, all those kinds of things. I was surprised, I guess I shouldn't have been. Oh, by the way, this yarn is Elsa Wool Cormo in the Woolen Spun Sport Weight in the natural white color, and I love it to death. Clearly I'm an Elsa Wool fan. Okay, so the first thing I did, here's my little notebook, was sketch a little schematic. And clearly I'm never going to win any awards in drawing or fashion illustration, but you get the idea that I knew I wanted a peplum, and then I knew I wanted something dramatic with the waist, and I want saddle shoulder sleeves, and then I added in the measurements. Obviously these are my own measurements, so I haven't shared them in the past because I'm very aware of thin privilege, and so I don't want to share my numbers and then have anyone comparing themselves or that kind of thing. But hopefully, I mean, you can't really talk about math without talking about numbers, so just be aware that I know about thin privilege, and I think it's a deeply unfortunate aspect of society and due to that, so I just want to include that caveat. Oh, and then I sketched in my little shawl collar. Is that going to show up? Yeah. So for me, 33 inches at the bust is 0 negative ease. And for a cardigan, that's what I want because I don't want the buttons pulling. When I do a pullover, I think this is like 4 inches of negative ease. I don't know. I'm smaller busted, and I find that without any negative ease, I end up looking very rectangular and flat-chested. That's something for another day. So then the waistband I have marked as 22 inches. My waist is actually 24 inches. But because I wear cardigans over dresses, I really need the waist to kind of cinch in. And I think I ended up changing my mind, and I'm going for 23 inches, so just 1 inch of negative ease. And that's because I've noticed that most of my knitwear tends to grow a little during the day, so I didn't want to start at 0 and then have it get floppy as the day progressed. But that's just my thing. And then with the peplum, of course, I don't have to worry if I'm having a bloated day. You know, my belly is a little bit below the smallest part of my waist, so the peplum will hide any of that. And then I decided on the length because I'm quite long-waisted. So from my shoulder to my waist is 18 inches. And then I decided on a 3-inch peplum length because I measured different sweaters that I have. And I decided that 3 inches would look good, would be the most versatile one for me for just how I envision using the sweater. So then I had those numbers out of the way. And then with the peplum, I knew that and so then I started looking at it, and I realized that with those numbers and the gauge that I was getting, I wasn't going to be able to put a ton of cables, on each piece, just because there's only so many stitches you can cram in, and I didn't want the fabric to be super dense because then I overheat. So I knew going in that I wanted honeycomb somewhere, I wanted braid cables, I wanted one of those interlacing cables on the backs, and I wasn't really sure how I was going to get all that. So I was trying to fit the honeycomb up in here, and it was a little stressful and not working out. And so then I was thinking about putting it in the waist shaping, but I didn't really want that fabric right, on my side. So once I decided to just put the honeycomb in the peplum, then everything sort of came together, and I was able to just kind of look at the cables, and they all have different feels to them, and get an idea of what would look well balanced. And then I pulled out my Ann Budd Handy Book of Patterns, and I looked at Handy Book of Sweater Patterns, and that includes basically generic recipes based on gauge, and it's like, I think 3 to 7 inches or stitches per inch, and then a very wide size range. And she does it in increments of 2 inches. So there's a 32 inch and a 34 inch, but not a 33 inch. But that was fun. So I looked at those numbers to find out how many I would need to bind off for the arm, and then get an idea of the V-neck shaping and how wide I needed it to be at the shoulders, because then I could kind of design it so that at least one cable was going to go all the way up. And I wanted to make sure that the armhole shaping in particular did not interrupt the cables. So that's why I put this cable over to the edge, because it seemed like it would be the trickiest to continue with the slow decreasing that you need for the V-neck. And I put the braid over here because it seems like it'd be the easiest to decrease in pattern. And then as you can see, I ended up having to decrease this in pattern. And so what I ended up doing is, rather than putting one decrease right on the edge, like here, every other row I would decrease, I put 2 decreases in so that they'd be symmetrical, so this cable was, you know, shrinking symmetrically every 4 rows. So I was doing the same rate of decreasing, just in a slightly different way. And I just did that as I was knitting. I didn't try to plan this ahead of time. I think some people would graph it, but I have found that, I don't know, for me, I tend to think better when I see the stitches in front of me, and then when I'm working on graph paper ahead of time. And so then I ended up putting just a single stitch between each of the cables because I liked how it divided it into panels. And then the last thing I needed to do was, you know, plug all that into gauge. Because I had swatched all of these, I could just measure how many inches they were. And then I knew that I needed basically an extra 2 inches because remember there's going to be a button band too. So I did very quick increases so that the buttons wouldn't strain on the cardigan. And that just happened to work out so that all the armhole binds-offs is in the seed stitch as well, which was very convenient. I don't know if that was helpful, if I should have gone into more detail or less. Let me know. Obviously, I'm talking about this to kind of make you see that it's much easier to design your own sweater than you might think. So if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. And now we will get to my topic of the week. One thing that I've noticed on the Ravelry forums is that there isn't a lot of talk about kind of the nitty-gritty details that you find yourself facing in knitting, if that makes sense. So for instance, I joined a couple sock groups and everyone very enthusiastically knits socks, and there tends to be a lot of participation on the knit-along threads. But I don't see people kind of swapping ideas about their favorite toes or favorite heels or if they've found certain tricks. Those kinds of tidbits I find very interesting. And so I thought that I would start a little series where I talk about various knitting details as my topic. And appropriately, I thought I would begin with cast-ons. And first I want to say, I could have sworn that someone asked me what kind of cast-on I use for sweaters. But I can't find this question anywhere. It's driving me crazy. I swear I've checked my Instagram account, I've checked YouTube, I've checked my blog comments, I've checked the group forum, and I can't find this. So maybe I hallucinated it. I don't know. If you did ask the question, feel free to let me know so I can give you credit. But regardless, I want to talk about interesting things, so I'll start with cast-ons. And just in case someone did ask that question, I will say I don't do one specific cast-on for sweaters. For me, I like to pick the cast-on that blends best with the feel of what I'm making. And I'm one of those people who's pretty particular about bind-offs and cast-ons matching, or at least going together. So that's important to me. So if I'm going to be doing a project where there is a bind-off and a cast-on both, because a lot of times there isn't, like socks or gloves, mittens, those kinds of things, then I will think about that ahead of time, and sometimes I'll even do a provisional cast-on so that everything's a bind-off instead of a cast-on so that they all match. This sweater I did a channel cast-on, and then I did a picot bind-off because they've both got little spots, and the channel cast-on is traditional. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So for me, I pretty much never use the knitted cast-on. I find it annoying to work. I don't know. For some reason, I can't get into the groove. I was taught how to knit with the long tail cast-on. So that goes a lot more quickly for me than a knitted cast-on. But I don't necessarily use the long tail cast-on terribly frequently. I do use a variation of it, which is the German twisted cast-on, a lot, because it's a very stretchy cast-on. So if I'm knitting a pair of socks and the cuff is anything other than 1x1 rib, I'm probably going to do a German twisted cast-on. And I just really like how it looks, so I did it on this sweater too. It's hard to tell because the cables kind of mess with the fabric a bit, but it's just got these cute little pearl bumps. I don't know why I like it more than the long tail cast on, but so that's become one of my go-tos. My second go-to is just a provisional cast on with the crochet chain. And because I'm a crocheter, it's very easy for me to whip up a chain, and then I really enjoy picking up stitches. If you're a continental knitter and you are trying to pick up stitches with the yarn in your left hand, I would recommend trying the yarn in your right hand instead. I used to think picking up stitches was the worst thing ever because I am by default a continental knitter, but if you do it English style, it goes really quickly. Anyway, so I do the crochet cast on, I just crochet a chain, and then I go in and pick up a stitch for each of the bumps. And I find that a very useful cast on as well, because then I can unravel it and do a bind off later that matches. The other one that I love and use a lot is the tubular cast on. I pretty much use this in any situation that involves 1x1 ribbing, so you can see it here on the gloves. Maybe you can see it if the camera decides it's important enough. Okay. As you can see, it's very stretchy. It's going to stretch as much as the fabric. And it just creates a really nice, firm, neat edge. And basically it looks like the ribbing continues over the entire way. And in this, I tend to do twisted 1x1 ribbing, but if you did just regular 1x1 ribbing, it would be entirely reversible. So those are probably my 3 favorite cast-ons at the moment. I also quite like the cable cast-on for when I need a firm edge, which is a little fiddly, not as fiddly for me as the knitted cast-on, but so those are probably the 4 that I use the most, and I will occasionally research to find a cast-on. If I know I'm going to do a specific bind-off, then I'll research for a matching cast-on. So for instance, when I did the Sylvan cowl, I knew that I was going to be using Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind-off, and so I did some Googling and I discovered this thing called the Chinese waitress cast-on, which looks very close, and so I ended up doing that. It's an incredibly fiddly cast-on, but for me it's worth it because I'm a details person, so I really like, especially for a cowl where, you know, you're twisting it so the edges aren't going to be like right next to each other too. And it has an equal amount of elasticity. And I think that's all I have to say about cast-ons. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say is, so if I'm doing a cast-on, the other nice thing about the tubular cast-on, and I mentioned this in a previous episode's tip section, I do the tubular cast-on based on the tech knitting tutorial, and so you don't need to do a long tail. You just start, you know, you leave like 6 inches to weave in later, and then you just start. So you don't have to guess how much yarn you're going to use. In something like this, where I was starting with the German twisted cast on, and even this one isn't too many stitches, but the back where I was casting on something, I don't know, somewhere around 160, 170 stitches, then what I did was I like to just err on the side of too long, because the worst that happens then is you cut off some yarn later. The worst that happens if it's too short is you have to rip it all out and start over again. So I do like a full wingspan worth. And I think I did 1 wingspan for each of the fronts, and then I did 2 wingspans for the back. And that left me with quite a bit, but I'm going to be seaming. Anyway, so yeah, I definitely err on the side of too long when I'm going to be casting on a lot of stitches at once, and I just really don't want to have to run out of yarn. That would make me sad. And then the other cast on that I do, I prefer to knit top-down socks if everything else is the same, but sometimes there are good reasons to knit toe up. And in that case, actually the first toe I did on this was a short row toe, but it ended up being that I had so few stitches to work with that I decided that that was not the best thing for me. So then I do the Jenny's Magic cast on, which I will include in the link. And I do it on DPNs. Some people say that you have to do it magic loop style, But, you know, it's a little fiddly for the first couple rows on DPNs, probably fiddlier than it would be on Magic Loop, but as we've established at this point, I strongly prefer DPN, so I'm willing to put up with that fiddliness. Yeah. The other I have enjoyed, there's a book from my library called Cast On Bind Off that includes quite a few different cast-ons. And then there's another one that I wanted to get from the library, and I put it on hold, but I wasn't able to get there this week. I haven't been feeling well to pick it up from the library, so I'll have to get it another time. But I will report back on whether that is a useful book or not. But feel free to share if you have a favorite cast-on or if you have any tips and tricks, and, you know, why you have found a certain thing most useful. I would love to talk about those kinds of little knitting things, or, you know, the decisions that very rarely does a pattern specify a cast on, so that's where your kind of knitting idiosyncrasies can shine through. As I mentioned, I haven't been feeling very well, and so when my illnesses are acting up, I basically have to constantly triage things and decide what's more and what's less important. And so I haven't been taking many photographs of my outfits just because, you know, in the scale of feeding myself, walking the dog, photographing my outfits, one of these is clearly a little less important. And, oh, I wanted to say real quickly, if you don't know anything about chronic illnesses and you are curious, maybe, I don't know, if you're interested in learning more, there's an excellent blog post called Spoon Theory that I will link to in the show notes that basically tries to give healthy people an idea of what it's like to live with chronic illnesses. So just since I mentioned my illnesses in the videos just because they affect everything about me, so in case that has made you more curious about what that's like, I will link to that. Back to Knits in the Wild. I only have 2 outfits to show you this week. One of them is from last Saturday. I was meeting some people for the first time, just in like a casual, chatty conversation setting. And so I wanted to feel confident. And I decided to wear my Melusine cardigan because that just always gives me a boost of confidence. And I wore it over a brown fit and flare dress this time instead of a gray one. You'll see if I continue to photograph my outfits that I pretty much follow the same handful of silhouettes or uniforms all the time. I just vary the colors and the little details, but yeah, you'll never see me in like a pencil skirt or anything. So hopefully you won't get bored, but yep. And as you can see, this outfit proved very useful for, you know, letting Thistle and Moth know how much I miss them after I got home from the cafe. They wanted to be in my lap straight away, and there's almost no sun left, so that's why they're all blurry looking in the photos. And then the other outfit is the one that I'm wearing now. I took a couple photos before I started recording. And as I mentioned, I'm wearing my Guernsey-esque jumper, and I'm once again wearing my vintage wool plaid skirt. I can't remember if this has been on the podcast before. I know I Instagrammed it. The knee-high navy blue socks, they're wool, but they're not hand knit. I got them from the Vermont County General Store. No, Vermont General Store. I don't think, yeah. And I got them in the fall because I did not have any navy blue yarn to knit knee-high socks, so I just ordered a pair. And they have proven very handy. And I'm wearing a pair of wool tights from that same store under them. I think it's a German brand. They're really comfy, and they've got the actual heels and gussets, which I find very important for comfort. And yeah, so pretty much head to toe wool because it is cold outside. I'm wearing my knee-high boots that are wool lined as well. They're German, by Riker. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. I never studied German. And I think I forgot to take any accessory photos. I apologize. I will work on that. It's just, you know, when I'm not feeling well, there's only so much you can do. So that's Knits in the Wild. As far as fiber passages I encountered in my reading, I reread Daughter of the Forest by Juliette Marier this week, and that is a retelling of the Swan fairy tale that I talked about when I was wearing my swan sweater. And I read it in high school, and I don't think I've read it since then. So, you know, I was hazy on a lot of the details. And obviously, she does spend quite a bit of the book spinning and then weaving and sewing. But in this book, she's doing it with starwort, and it constantly stings her, so it's kind of a sad passage. And I already returned the ebook to the library, so I don't have any particular things to point out. But I would generally recommend the novel. I think it's beautifully written, and Marie is very good at evoking. It's set in kind of Ireland when Christianity is just starting to come over. So I guess the early medieval period. And so she's very wonderful at evoking that setting and landscape and creating characters that you really fall in love with. But I do need to include a trigger warning. There is a rape scene, and then later that character, you know, reflects on what has happened. And so I personally feel that unless a book is going to be entirely about sexual violence and the recovery from it, which I have read a few books that have done a beautiful job of that, I don't think it should be in the book at all. So I think the book would have been better if that had all just been left out. But that's my personal opinion, and if I ignore that, then I love the book and would definitely recommend it. I just like to include that warning because I know that depending on your background, if you come across that without any warning, it might trigger your own memories or traumas, and I would feel terrible if a book that I recommended traumatized someone because there was no warning. So, the last thing I thought I would include is a little book review of Barbara Walker's A Treasury of Knitting Patterns. This is the first volume. And when I first began knitting, I remember checking this out from the library and going through it and being like, okay. And so recently, a very kind viewer told me that she doesn't use her copy and would I like her to mail it to me? And of course, I said, that is fantastic. I would love that. And so it arrived in the mail, and it's so funny because reading it now with, you know, much more knitting knowledge than when I began, I'm just utterly in love with it. I love Barbara Walker's like little observations about a lot of the stitches, and I love all the different options for everything. Just flipping through this has filled me with so many different ideas, and I ended up using a couple, I think, of the cables for the sweater. Well, I know I'm going to use this one on the back of the sweater. Oh, I probably shouldn't. Okay. So yeah, so it is laid out. There's samples of every single stitch, and she gives some suggestions about what kind of fabric it's going to create. And then at the very end, she talks a little bit about how to make like a fisherman's sweater. So she talks a little bit about how to use these stitches to make actual knitted objects. And there's a wonderful little introduction as well. So I absolutely loved this. The one thing is everything's knit, or all the instructions are for flat knitting. So if you want to be able to knit these stitches in the round, then you're going to need to know how to convert them on your own. That's not an issue for me, but I know that it might be for some people. And the knittingfool.com online stitch dictionary includes a lot of these stitches, but I really like having the paper copy to flip through. So yeah, I just am utterly in love with this. I'm so happy to have it on my shelf now. And every time my favorite used book site is Better World Books. So every time I place an order, I check to see, and none of her books are ever on there, but I might end up having to splurge on the retail versions of the other volumes one day because, yeah, I mean, between this book and then something like Aunt Bud's book, I mean, you could knit forever on those two books, just watching everything in your imagination come to life. Pretty wonderful. And that is all I have for this 2 weeks. Thanks so much for catching up with me, and I will see you guys again. Bye.